Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to this evening's City Circle talk on the topic of Islamophobia. My name is Sonia Raga and I will be your chairperson for this evening. I volunteer for an organisation called MEND. MEND stands for Muslim Engagement and Development. MEND is set up to strategically tackle Islamophobia in the UK through awareness and through engagement with media and politics. And so this evening's talk is very timely, not only because we've been exposed once again to some of the dreadful Islamophobic attacks. A lot of you would have seen the video that went viral, the incident on the bus. Anti-Muslim hate crime is up once again, as reported by the Metropolitan Police. But also, we are at the doorstep of Islamophobia Awareness Month. Now, for those of you who don't know about this, Islamophobia Awareness Month was tabled in Parliament last year, and MEND was instrumental in getting this passed. It is a national awareness campaign that runs through the month of November. And so I'm very excited to be joined by our very expert panel here today on the topic. And I request from you, the audience, to bring a special kind of listening to this talk today, because we do have a very diverse panel. On my left, we have Dr. Alan and Dr. Salman Saeed, who will be looking at the subject from an academic perspective. And on my right, we have Raza and Asif, who will be looking at the topic from a more practical angle, since it's the work that they are involved in, day out. Now, we did purposefully construct it to be a diverse panel. We didn't intend for it to be an all-male panel. We did advertise to have Arzu Mirali here, but instead we have Raza Kazim, who is Arzu's colleague. And we're delighted to have you here, Raza, as we are delighted to have all of our guest speakers here. Thank you very much for being with us. Okay, so the way I want to run this discussion today is I want to take it from the academic through to the practical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each of our speakers to talk for around 10 minutes, if that is okay. I'll introduce each of the speakers before they speak, so that the introductions don't get lost. And then we will open it up to you, our esteemed audience, to take part in hopefully a lively Q&A. So I do request at this point, if you do have any questions throughout, do keep them for the Q&A session of part of the evening. Okay, we also do want to enroll those people that aren't actually here in the room today through social media. So for those of you on Twitter, we are using the hashtag CTCC Talks and hashtag IAM2015. I am standing for Islamophobia Awareness Month. Okay, so without much ado, I'll introduce our first guest speaker to talk, Dr. Chris Allen, who is a lecturer at the University of Birmingham. Chris Allen has been researching the phenomenon of Islamophobia for the last decade and a half. Dr. Allen's research ranges from the problematisation of Muslims and Islam in Britain today, Muslim women victims of hate crime, and anti-Islam ideologies of the far right. Dr. Allen has also been an independent advisor to the cross-government working group on anti-Muslim hate. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks very much for inviting me. My first experience of City Circle was about 14, 15 years ago. and I was working for the Forum Against Islamophobia and Racism at the time, which had just been set up just around just after 9/11. And I never ever came to a City Circle event, but I was aware that they were there, so I finally got to one. So thanks for that. When I was invited, Ramiz said that he would like me to kind of set some context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about really a couple of the kind of challenges that I've experienced in my research over the past decade and a half, and sort of try and then bring that up to date and offer a kind of reflection in the hope that maybe it will generate some questions later. It's a strange one really, because since I started researching this topic just before 9/11, and it's been probably the most interesting and stimulating and worrying and distressing period of time that you could be looking at a phenomenon like this. And it's given me so much to kind of think about, and it gives me something new and a challenge every single week. And so, there's something really interesting in that. But over that period of time, what's really come through is the fact that Islamophobia has remained contested, it's remained extremely complex, it's very fluid, it's constantly moving, and it's extremely emotive as well, so as we would expect with the topic that it is. And so two issues really have been recurrent in terms of this. And what I would say is that the first is the question of what is Islamophobia, and the second one is, do we actually have evidence that it exists? And these two questions have been put at me constantly over 15 years. So what I want to do is just start off, and I have a very kind of clear understanding of what Islamophobia is. It's a discriminatory phenomenon which is very similar in kind of way it functions and works and its kind of drivers in terms of racism or homophobia or disablism. It's a very traditional discriminatory phenomenon. It's also quite different in that I think that what we have with Islamophobia is it's completely of the moment, it's completely contemporary, and unlike racism or homophobia or disablism or sexism, is that it has this huge global influence as well. And so what we see is that something can happen in Afghanistan and it will be projected onto Birmingham. And we had Tony Blair last year when, with the Trojan horse scandal in Birmingham, when the hoax allegations that 20 schools were being taken over by Islamists, and Tony Blair said, what we see in Boko Haram with the kidnap of 200 schoolgirls is the exact same extremism what we see in Birmingham in the Trojan horse schools. So we have this distinct global element there, which I think makes Islamophobia that little bit more extraordinary in terms of that. I think that Islamophobia it's definitely not about disagreeing with Muslims. It's definitely not about sort of, insisting that everybody has the same beliefs as Muslims. It's not insisting that everybody kind of, upholds the views of Islam. And it's definitely not about not being able to critique or criticise Muslims or the religion of Islam when appropriate. When it does become Islamophobia, in my view, is that when any of those things are used to justify bigotry or hate, or to try and shape prejudice or discrimination against Muslims. And there's a clear difference there. A critique or criticism isn't necessarily a way in which to garner hate, and I think that we can take that and we can understand that, and that for me is that kind of baseline there. I think that in terms of the term, for 15 years I've been told, we should be using anti-Islamism. I remember that 15 years ago, and anti-Islamism now has a completely different meaning to what it would have done 15 years ago. We have the anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Muslim racism or so on. Let's be honest, we know what we're talking about with Islamophobia. We've got other terms, homophobia, which is as equally inappropriate. We've got anti-Semitism, which is as equally inappropriate. And so for me, what I find is that when people say, the term doesn't work, it's actually just a smokescreen. Those people who don't like the term Islamophobia wouldn't like the term anti-Muslim racism. It's just about trying to close down the discussion. And also as well, in terms of definition as well, it's an interesting one because when I've been trying to do policy work and trying to work with government or with sort of local government or Muslim organisations, and people will say, well, what's the definition of Islamophobia? We need this definition because we can't tackle it until we've got a definition. And it's very easy, is that, well, we never set up a definition of racism that was solid, that was single, that was applied in all contexts before we address that. We understand what this is, and so again, this for me is one of these kind of like, it's just another smokescreen. And the people, who want a definition wouldn't like the definition when we give it to them, so they'd want to change it and so on. So for me, there's kind of three elements to Islamophobia, and the first one is this kind of ideology. And at the university I'm at, we have a whole module for a whole year about what is ideology, so I'm going to cut that down very quick. So for me, though, it's like this kind of idea, it's kind of like a white noise. It's kind of, it shapes your thinking, it shapes your, it's why I call it Islamophobia thinking. It's kind of the white noise out there, about Muslims and Islam, the way in which Muslims and Islam are understood. And I use the example, I say, if you walk into W.H. Smith's in the morning, you look at the Daily Mail, and it's got a photo of a Muslim woman wearing a niqab on. You know she's not saved an old elderly lady from drowning. You know that she's not saved a cat that's stuck in a tree. You know it's going to be a bad story. You know that already it's going to be negative. And that symbolism comes through very quickly and very easily in terms of that. So that's why I call the ideology, very simply the ideology, that kind of white noise there. The second part is about people's attitudes and opinions, and that white noise, people see that newspaper, people see titles with a headline jihad, and they say, oh, Muslims are a problem. Muslims are a problem. Yeah, Islam's a problem. Oh, if we didn't have Muslims here, we didn't have Islam in Britain, if we had a more British form of Islam, that would be better. Where's the Reformation in Islam? That's what we need. Let's rewrite the Quran. These sort of things. This is so people's opinions and attitudes. And what we see is that you can look at opinion polls. And there was the British Social Attitude Survey of 2010, and I loved the question. It was like people are more cool towards Islam than they are any other religion. And it was like kind of this really easy way of going, I don't really like Muslims, I don't really like Islam, but it's like, I don't want to say that, so we're cool about it. I'm a little bit cool, I'm not very warm towards them. So we get this and we see that. And then the final part is really where a lot of my research is kind of going now, is this kind of exclusionary stuff. The kind of how do this ideology and these kind of opinions, how do they then work at the kind of coalface? So some research we did a couple of years ago, we interviewed 20 visible Muslim women about their experience of hate crime at the street level. Because I don't know if you know, but around 70% of all Islamophobic hate crime is directed at visible Muslim women. And it's the only hate crime, it's the only manifestation of hate crime where women are the most likely victim. If you look at anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, disableism, it's always men. Islamophobia is really distinct and different than that because it's around Muslim women. And that's around 70% of that. And so within this, there's a whole lot of things, and the kind of symbolic value of the Muslim woman, the visible Muslim woman, is around otherness, around oppression, all these kind of things that we kind of get. And I think that from this kind of white noise, there's two issues which I want to kind of pull out. And the first one is that Muslims are violent, Muslims are barbaric, Muslims are extremists. You've got this kind of one angle there, which is that. The other angle you get is that Muslims are not really British. They don't really want to be a part of Britain, and they're against our culture and our way of life, and they're trying to undermine our institutions and so on. So you've got these two kind of parts of this there. When it comes to evidence, this is another big thing. Is like, where's the evidence for this? Where's the evidence? Well, we as academics, we've been writing papers giving qualitative evidence of the experience of Muslim women, of people in mosques that are attacked. I can give you, some horrific stories of, a family, a Muslim family wakes up in the morning and around the outside of their house, their actual house where they live, are pigs' heads and smearing of pig's blood. This is their house. They've got 3 children in that house. We don't need a statistic to actually say that that's, untenable. If that's happening to one person, 1,000 people, or 10,000 people, actually that's completely untenable. That's not what Britain should be about. We should be tackling this without any sort of reservations whatsoever. And I think that what we get here is that there's this kind of other thing in terms of this, is that, well, when we get the right amount of numbers, then we can tackle it. And I remember I did an interview for Channel 4 Dispatches 10 years ago, and the interview, and I won't mention his name, but it's on the internet if you check it out. And he said to me, he said, well, he said in the 70s, when we had Paki bashing, we had loads of Asians killed. And I was horrified. Is that the benchmark? Is that when we begin to act, when we have Muslims being killed? And sort of now we actually do have Muslims being killed. Mohammed Salim in Birmingham, Muhsin Ahmed in Rotherham. We know that Islamophobia has gone to that level where people will die as a result of Islamophobia. So just to conclude on this, I want to kind of reflect on 2 things, and I think that if we look at the evidence, if we look at definitions, if we look at these kind of approaches, and I think that we need to look at what the government is trying to do. In Britain, we are against hate, we are against discrimination, we are against all of these things that underpin any discriminatory phenomenon. That's what British values are about. British values are about looking after the underdog, protecting the underdog, making sure that people are treated fairly, making sure on the whole that we're treated equally. They're the true British values for me. That's what I would say. What we've got at the moment is we've got two issues which are very, very important. We've got this recent announcement that Islamophobic hate crime is going to be sort of recorded separately. Now that in itself is a fantastic move, because now we start to have the evidence. We've got these kind of institutional, state-endorsed data and statistics that we can say to critics, this is what Islamophobia looks like, this is where it is. The problem we have with that, it's being introduced under counter-terror legislation. And for me, this sends out a very, very worrying message, because when you look at that white noise, that Islamophobic thinking, within that is that Muslims are terrorists. Muslims are extremists. And so why are we not bringing hate crime in under hate crime legislation? We have definitions of hate crime, we have hate crime legislation specifically for every other type. Why is Islamophobic hate crime coming in under counter-extremism? And I think there may be an issue there around a pacifier. It's like, well, the government's saying, we'll actually sort this out and we'll tackle this, but don't rock the boat when it comes to the extremism stuff. The second point that I want to just touch on, and it's my concluding point, is this issue of British values. This kind of idea around the Britishness agenda. For me, the Britishness agenda isn't about sort of saying who we are or what we are. It's about saying who's not British. These values that the government have come up with are entirely vacuous. They are not specific whatsoever to Britain. If you look at Swedish values, or Canadian values, Australian values, actually we would all subscribe to that. So there's nothing in there which makes us specific. There's nothing in there that actually says this is what we are as Britain, this is what Britain is about. And I think that what is worrying with this as well is that when you've got David Cameron saying things such as Muslims in this country need to be more British. I mean, I don't know what that means. How do I become more British? I wouldn't know. What does it mean? I whistle God Save the Queen every day? I don't know. I have no idea what this means. But what it does is it sends out this message. It sends out a very clear message that Muslims are not actually British. And I think that, again, when you look at that white noise, that Islamophobia thinking, part of that is Muslims are against our culture. And I think that those two messages which are coming through in terms of the way in which Islamophobia is being tackled reinforces some of those ideas in Islamophobia. And I think there's a very, we have a potential there where actually one could reinforce the other. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Brilliant. So we'll move on. Like I mentioned earlier, please save your questions. If you think it's ink it, write it down, and we'll come back to those questions. So next is Dr. Salman Saeed. Salman is a lecturer at Leeds University and is also the founding editor of Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies. His major publications include Recalling the Caliphate, Thinking Through Islamophobia, and A Fundamental Fear, which was actually banned by the Malaysian government. So I guess you're all going to run out to read it now to see why it was banned. But I've actually attended a summer school where Dr. Salman Saeed has lectured, and he is one of my favourite lecturers, so I'm very pleased that he is here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sonia, for that lead up. I could only disappoint now, in the time I've got, I just want to make a couple of points, because a lot of what Chris has said I want to endorse, so there's no point in repeating that. But I want to start off with asking you a question. When did racism become a bad thing? Now, the reason why I ask this is nowadays everybody thinks racism is bad. Yeah? From Nigel Farage, from the EDL, nobody thinks racism is a good thing. Yeah? And they will take you to court or shout and holler, say, we are not a racist. We also have members from ethnic minorities in the EDL, etc., etc. So there's a kind of interesting thing that nobody wants to be a racist anymore. You know, it's just not the done thing. And you think, well, this is okay, it's good, nobody wants to be a racist, we're really pleased about that. But when did people think they were racist? Now, what is interesting is that there was polling done in the mid-1960s on white Americans during the height of the civil rights struggle. And some of the questions they asked was, well, how do you think African Americans in the South are being treated? And overwhelming majority of white Americans thought that the African Americans in the South were treated really well. And they couldn't understand what the fuss was about. And there must have been some sort of agitators going around making trouble. So it's kind of interesting that even now, where you have almost this kind of iconic description of how civil rights was central and fulfillment of the American dream, at the time, it was considered to be nothing of the sort. And the reason why I mention these questions is because we need to remind ourselves often that the way the world appears to us isn't always the way it represents itself and was represented in the past. Now, many of the things that you hear about Islamophobia, some of them which Chris mentioned, idea, well, what does it actually mean? It doesn't really exist. If it exists, it's justified. And if it's not justified, it's only a minority thing anyway. Nobody's doing it. Yeah? All of these excuses were there about racism. It was argued that racism didn't exist. If it did exist, it was appropriate because that's the way it was. And anyway, there are only a few bad apples. So in a way, what you have is a very similar way of talking about racism and Islamophobia. And that shouldn't surprise us, because what I would like to suggest to you is this. Islamophobia belongs to the grammar of racism. In a sense, what Islamophobia is, how racism is possible in an era when everyone says they're not a racist anymore. Yeah? So you're talking about, and we often see an example of this when people are willing to say things like, well, you can't say things about this group or that group, but you can say it about Muslims. And that seems to be quite an interesting possibility, that you can have people talking about Muslims, and you could actually show a continuity around the descriptions that were used in racism to describe Muslims. Yeah? Around all kinds of ways. And one of the key factors is that you use particular incidents to indict not just that particular incident, but everyone around it. For example, the sex violence committed in Rotherham by a number of South Asian men was treated as a cultural and religious problem. Sex violence committed by two Yorkshire men, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, and Jimmy Savile, were never said to represent anything about Yorkshire men. It was never said, what is wrong with Yorkshire culture that produces this kind of predatory behavior? Now, why is it that one set of criminal activities or hateful activities tell us something about the culture, the values, and religion, whatever you want, and the others don't? Now, you can see this pattern being repeated again and again. When Andres Breivik killed 70 people, this was really someone who went gone mad. There was clearly something pathological in Andres Breivik. If a Muslim commits a similar act, that tells us something about Islam, about their culture, etc. And that, I think, is quite interesting, how Muslims become ambassadors for Islam. And as Muslims know, we are the worst ambassadors for Islam. Well, we all know this, and we don't try to make each other ambassadors for Islam, but this is how we're read. Now, it seems to me, if we are to understand how Islamophobia operates, we have to understand its relationship with racism. And we have to understand the history of racism. And that means two things. Firstly, we have to avoid the belief that Western societies were combating racism from the very beginning until they somehow got lost their way. And the true essence of Western society is combat of racism. In fact, you could argue that modern Western societies were founded upon racial and colonial violence. And that is actually still needs to be recognized. Yeah? So, for example, when we are told that the British Empire did great stuff by abolishing slavery in 1807, and we should remember, celebrate that. We're not told who actually helped install Atlantic slavery as a global phenomenon as well. So it's like it's great that they abolished it in 1807, but it might have been good if they hadn't started in the first place. But let that be. I mean, it's good for people to recognize what they've done wrong. But there's a serious point to this lack of historical knowledge, because it forces us to simply perpetuate many of the examples, many of the situations that confronted the anti-racist struggles without recognizing them. And one of them is a sense of embarrassment. People did not want to label racism because in the end it was seen like some sort of special pleading. And also the idea of racism, funnily enough, was that those who were actually subject to racism, it was somehow thought they were the ones who were privileged. And you see a similar phenomenon, that Islamophobia is denied because it is argued that Muslims get everything. And this is not just denied by resentful members of white society, but it's denied often by many other non-Muslim communities. That is, the Muslims are getting everything. So there's a sense of theft of joy there. That why is it that Muslims get everything and we get nothing? They're the ones who are privileged. And again, this is a very interesting trope that's constantly repeated around it. That any act of resistance to injustice is presented not as a resistance, but as an attack on key values. Now, Chris mentioned a problem with values, and we don't actually know what they are. And of course, you could multiply this thing and say, well, how do fundamental British values differ from fundamental French values? Is France not democratic as Britain? Not liberal as Britain? Whatever. So we know that this is not simply anything empirical. It's actually a metaphor for many other things. I think what we need to be careful about is whether values can be attached to any collective identity. And when they are, they're doing a particular kind of work of policing. It's not so much the values, it's who can actually be part of that community, which is the key. And so values are used as a way of actually policing who can belong, who cannot belong. Now the difficulty I think we face in Islamophobia is threefold. One, not only is it that many people have forgotten the history of racism except something to commemorate on Martin Luther King's birthday, they've forgotten how insidious and how deeply rooted it was. But we've also forgotten that the structure of racism actually helped split the way that the world is actually constructed. And what I mean by this is Islamophobia causes many problems because one of the things that happened with the settlement of civil rights was there was a split between things that were done inside a country, domestic affairs, and what was done outside the country. Now, what is interesting is that the civil rights movement was most powerful when it was actually combining both a domestic critique of American politics and the American enslavement and perpetuation of violence against African Americans with the wider anti-colonial struggle. That model broke. So, and you could see that breaking in two ways. Firstly, racism as a category, as a concept, emerges to describe what was happening inside Germany in the 1930s. That's the first way it's used. But what Germany was doing in the 1930s was what was being done in the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, in the United States. So the question is, why did the word racism was needed when in fact the whole colonial order was doing exactly the same sorts of things? And I would argue that one of the reasons for having racism is that it allows the preservation that what happens inside these countries and what happens outside are two different things. And the problem with Muslims, to put it this way, and I hope this is going to be properly edited because otherwise it could be a very unfortunate sentence. The problem with Muslims is they just don't keep to their boundaries. And so the idea that you can have Muslims in the domestic and Muslims outside is actually really difficult. Because while governments may be willing to concede equal treatment or certain forms of justice or certain protection against violence, the problem they run into is when they have to do that externally. This is why it's quite interesting that David Cameron's bill about reporting Islamophobia is at the same time a bill which is going to perpetuate Islamophobia. And that makes it very, very difficult to actually situate this. Because what is required is a recognition that that racism was part of a global system, not something which was just inside particular countries. Similarly, Islamophobia is not something that can be felt as inside countries. It's actually a global system. And that's what it continually circulates, and this is how it gets its strength. This is what makes it more challenging. I think the final point I want to make is really that I think we have to understand Islamophobia. Ultimately, it's about a denial of Muslim agency. It's not so much about, and has different kinds of manifestations about it, and that denial of agency works at different places in different times. But there would not be Islamophobia if there were not Muslims. And there were only Muslims in this country after 1989. And what I want to say about this is not that there weren't halal shops and there weren't people who called themselves Muslims, etc. But the idea of a public Muslim presence is only possible after 1989 in Britain, around about 1991 in France. And you can see at different moments where Muslim as a category has emerged and alongside it Islamophobia has emerged. And this is the final point that I want to make, is that without the category of Islamophobia, many of these things could not be understood because they would not fit into the pattern of racism, because racism is something that's happened in the past and involves in this and this. And what we're actually seeing is a convergence around many different places where a Muslim political consciousness is emerging, probably not as a form as we would like. And Islamophobia is a response to that. And that's what's at stake here. And therefore, the only solution to Islamophobia is political engagement. And without political engagement, we're left with simply saying it's a bad thing. But as I tried to say to you in the beginning, everyone now thinks racism is a bad thing. But the reason why they think racism is a bad thing is because the civil rights movement changed the ideas of what was bad or not. Up till then, for 200 years or more, it was possible to be a racist and a good person. And hopefully, it will become impossible for someone to think they're morally good and Islamophobic. That is a challenge we face, and that is what I think we should be working towards.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. Definitely you didn't disappoint. I remember something you said about critical thinking. It's about disrupting the way that we think. Okay, so we've just talked about taken the academic perspective, and now we're going to move into the practical. Sorry. So our next speaker is Raza Kazim. Raza is a spokesperson for the Islamic Human Rights Commission, where he's been in charge of various local, national and international campaigns One of his major roles has been to challenge the injustices of the police by attending the monthly meetings at Scotland Yard for 4 years until the shoot-to-kill policy was fully exposed with the murder of Jean-Charles de Menzies, which I'm sure you all recall. So welcome, Raza.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you, City Circle, for inviting me. As was introduced right at the beginning, that I'm a substitute for Arzu Mirali, and I consider myself to be quite a poor substitute for Arzu Mirali. And I'm not doing this from the sense of some kind of self-deprecation, the British values thing, because I actually think the whole fundamental British values thing is a racist concept, and I might come to that in a race thing. There are the things that are being co-opted and measured. One of the things that Arzu Mirali has been working on is cutting edge of research into looking at what Muslims are feeling up and down the country. There's been extensive surveys done, longitudinal studies, and so on and so forth. So I think in that sense it would have been much more useful to have had a sense of the launch of the report that we're going to have for her to be speaking here. However, this is more of a community response and the kind of things that are going to be talked about in terms of what we as Muslims are going to be doing, how we're going to actually be able to combat different things, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to be sprinkling the stuff that I'm going to be talking about with some anecdotes and whatever about things that have been a personal experience and journey, and the kind of things that need to actually be done. Now, with regards to this whole issue of Islamophobia and the kind of where society, mainstream society, actually perceives Muslims, and one of the things that Saman mentioned was this idea of, first of all, that if I paraphrase slightly or extend slightly what's been said, is that idea of otherness that has been created. We have this idea of demonization that also was mentioned earlier in the editorial by Chris, and this is something that's part and parcel of how people are actually operating and what's actually going on. I remember going to school many years ago in secondary school, and one of the things that used to happen when I had the white friends that I had, it was like, you're okay, but it's all the other packies. And I never knew quite how to take that at the time. And it's like recognizing that idea of racism, of that idea of looking at dividing and ruling, trying to exceptionalize some people over others, and trying to make sure that there is something different and something exclusive. And it's something that is sought to be internalized by the white power structure, so that what you do is start to take that on board and say, oh, there is something different about me. I am different from these other people, and I am different. And that same idea of that racist thing, which is not very, as someone has eloquently spoken about, is not as popular. But that is the same thing that is going on in terms of the Muslims that are acceptable to the government, the Muslims that they want to listen to, and the Muslims that are actually have a very different view and have a very different critique of what the government actually has done, continuing to do, and the structural violence that it is continuing to perpetuate through the various arms of the institutions that it has at its disposal. And I say this kind of structural violence, and it's taken on a new dimension, I guess, in 2015, with the passing of the CTSA, Crime, Terrorism, Security Act, in which they have co-opted spaces of trust. So, social services, doctors, the medical profession, the NHS, teachers, as arms of the state. And I think it's also important for us to recognize within the European context that at one point, and I think it was in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and everyone was saying how wonderful it was, etc., etc. The Berlin Wall has come down, and post the Berlin Wall, what you had was the exposure of the number of people that had been informing on each other. And the Stasi police state that existed, much of the extent of that was actually brought out into the public domain, and people were shocked, society was shocked at the number of levels. And I think it was something like 1 in 3 people were informants of the state. Now, I don't know how many people there are here, but to that extent, I think we might well be about 20 or 30 people that could be informants of the state. And the thing that we need to recognize that while in that state, you had the situation where people were being informants, and they were ashamed of it, because people didn't know they were informants until the whole Berlin Wall and all that stuff was actually came down, and the issue was exposed in that way. Here, the stuff that goes on with the Crime and Terrorism Security Act is something far worse, because what you're doing is saying that with Prevent, when teachers could be trusted to discuss ideas, to engage with ideas that people are putting forward, you are not now being asked to criminalize that thought that might be problematic. Now, I went to a conference at the UCL on Tuesday where Vince Cable was speaking there, and one of the contributions from the audience was something where one of the people said, my Chinese students asked me that if I submit my essays and my assignments, will you report that back to the Chinese government? And everyone laughed at that. And everyone said, oh my God, oh dear, the Chinese, yeah, we know about them, we do really know about them. But actually, forget about others, look at yourself. Look at yourself, what are you doing with this Prevent? You're asking teachers, you're asking lecturers and university academic staff to actually report on those people that you feel are problematic in the views that they're expressing. So this is problematic. This is something that's going on right now. So what you've done is the idea of the Stasi police state, whereas they were ashamed of what they were doing in society to each other, the government has made it a legislative duty, a statutory duty, for you to actually do that to each other and feel that you are carrying out your law, your duty as a law-abiding, wonderful Muslim student, or in fact, forget Muslim student, there were many people who were really angry with what was actually being done, whether from a Muslim background or other backgrounds. And I think we need to recognize the state of play that is actually going on, and that there is an idea that we need to resist. This is something that is going on right across. And the worst thing is, within the teaching profession, this securitization of that space has been put into the safeguarding agenda. The language that is being used is fluffy language. Oh, we want to look after our pupils. We really are concerned about them. No, you're not. You are using all of the prejudices that people have as a result of the structural violence that is being perpetrated by the media, by the political establishment, by the police and so on, and internalizing it and being worried and then taking that on board and then applying it to your school pupils. I mean, even Vince Cable, even him, actually was laughing at the headline where a 3-year-old has been taken into Prevent care, where he said, really, this is getting ridiculous. Toddlers for the caliphate? This is how stupid it is. And yet, it's being justified by the establishment, by the people. And this is something that really needs to be thought about, how we're going to be, first of all, get informed about it. Don't get caught up in the stupid, fluffy language that the British government and the establishment is putting out about this. Unpick it, unpack it. And there are things that we have done. So mine has been involved in this with the Islamic Human Rights Commission. And it's something that we're exposing in terms of what the problems are, and then think about how you go about resisting it. There is no option but to resist that in all the capacity that you have. One of my roles, and the reason I speak about the teaching establishment, is because I am a secondary school teacher by profession, and I train people to be teachers currently in my current post at university. Now, this is something that is problematic because what people are doing are using it as a bureaucratic thing, an administrative thing. Oh, if we don't do this as teachers or as academics, Ofsted are going to come at us and get at us. So we have to tick that box to be able to say, yes, we've done our duty. Because by doing that duty, what people need to realize is that what they have done is internalized and enacted what the Stasi police state were doing. You have gone into that position as that and justifying it in some kind of lax way. In terms of some of the issues and the way that these things are actually being put out, if we start moving on to what the police have been doing. The police are obviously an important arm of the state, and they are involved in this idea of social engineering. So what we as Muslims can think, and what we as Muslims cannot think about. So what you've got is this idea coming on board that you had, I think it was Mac Chishti, I forget what designation he was in the police force, actually saying, signs of extremism are Muslims don't celebrate Christmas. Okay, yeah, I know, well, I don't celebrate Christmas. And Muslims boycott Marks and Spencer's because of their support for Israel. Yes, and your point is, is this not non-violent action against, whether you agree with it or not, and there might be different views here about that issue, but the point is, what's the problem with it? It was done against apartheid South Africa. Yes, the Thatcher government and all the political government in this country considered the ANC a terrorist organisation. Okay? So we need to keep the perspectives in mind as to what is going on with regards to this. The police has a lot to answer for. They destroyed a national organisation where people were able to articulate to the police authorities what the issue was in terms of how Muslims were able to address the grievances that we were getting, and they created localized, again, that concept of divine rule being taken forward. You also have the issues of I'm conscious of the time. I think I've only got about 20 seconds left, perhaps not even that. So I'll just leave you with a couple of things that, in terms of IHRC community responses, one of the things that we need to that we have done is look at creating the idea of Dignity Day, and this is going to be taking place this Sunday outside Downing Street, where we're talking about getting our dignity back as people. And this is across, not just Muslims, but right across. And it's something that we hope to build up on an annual level, and it's being linked up with the 10-year anniversary of what happened, the riots that took place in Paris, etc. Another concept is Genocide Memorial Day, which happens on the third Sunday of January, and it's to make sure that we get rid of this concept of hierarchy of victim, and we actually challenge that. Finally, two quotes that I think work quite nicely together. One from Winston Churchill: the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. So he recognizes where the colonialism of the future needs to be embedded. And Steve Biko, South African activist against apartheid: the most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. We need to make sure that we decolonize that mind and we free our minds and really resist in the way that is necessary in today's day and age.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Islamic Human Rights Commission have done amazing work, and thank you for your contribution and your activism. So it just so happens we do have someone from the police here. So Asif Sadiq, who's our final speaker, is the head of Equality, Diversity and Human Rights Unit at the City of London Police, and has worked for a number of different departments, including counter-terrorism, CID and community policing. Asif is also the president of the National Association of Muslim Police, which is an employee network spanning across 43 police forces, providing advice and guidance to all employees on issues to do with Islam. I guess there's quite a few issues there. So Asif is also an ambassador for remembering Srebrenica. of which I'm wearing the badge today. So thank you very much, Assert.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to clarify, I work for the City of London Police, not the Met Police, two different forces. City of London, Square Mile, probably one of the better police forces. So I want to start off really by covering some of the points which have been covered. I wanted to talk about critical comments around the definition of Islamophobia, which has not even been really finalised or looked at properly. One of the impacts of that is that when you look at, if we haven't got the definition right, how the police even addressing Islamophobia, if the government can't understand it, how does it roll out to us? And I think that's a really important thing, because when we're looking at training of our officers to understand what is Islamophobia, what isn't, it's very, very hard to really fix what the definition is, what falls under that category and what doesn't. The second thing I just quickly wanted to cover was, Salman, your comments around Muslims get everything. This really goes back to a really interesting point which I heard the other day in Brussels, made by one of the MEPs, Muslim MEPs, which was that when he was young, he was really seen as a Pakistani, British, and that kind of thing growing up. But now, the first thing that is attached is your Muslim identity. That's what's picked on, without any other identity whatsoever. That's the thing which comes to the forefront of everything. I want to break down really what I'm going to talk about into two halves, which is what the police can do, what the community can do, and some of the issues that we're seeing currently. So what can the police do? Well, for us as the Association of Muslim Police, we've been championing a lot of things within the police service. One's training. Training is really, really important on police officers being confident enough to deal with Islamophobia, to understand what Islamophobia is, and to address the community's concerns around that. Now that can only be done if they understand what the law says around Islamophobia, and what's going to get prosecutions, and what the community's concerns are. The second element to that is understanding with this recording of Islamophobia separately. Now, I know it was David Cameron announced that Islamophobia would be recorded separately, but a lot of police forces have been recording Islamophobia separately for quite some time. We've been working with MEND, so for example, there's 6 forces which are recording it beforehand. It is what is done with that data. That data is important, but it needs to be analysed, trends need to be picked up. We need to understand what that data presents for us. So there's no point in recording data if we're not going to use it, analyse it, and really look at it from a crime prevention perspective, and then tackle the hotspots and areas where crimes are taking place. Then we come to the community. Now, one of the things I champion a lot, and I think is really important, is that the community reports Islamophobia to the police service. Now that's for 2 reasons. Number one, if the police aren't aware, there's no understanding of what's taking place. Number 2, the more reports that come through, the bigger the picture is built on where these crimes are taking place, what kind of attacks are taking place, and then it forms the figures which the police have internally, which then raises it as a crime of significance, a crime which is causing major concern within the community, but this is only done when the reports are coming through and they're being measured. And looking at some of the cases we've had recently, it just goes to show you the importance of reporting crimes, and even the importance social media plays. Now the 2 incidents on the buses which took place a couple of weeks back, social media played such a big part on how those crimes were highlighted, how quick the response was from the police service, and it was really interesting that the Metropolitan Police put out, arrested the lady involved in the first incident after a couple of days and put out a statement immediately. Now that just goes to show you how powerful social media is and how important it is for these things to come across, be reported, and for us to raise awareness. The other issue, which I know has been highlighted a number of times, is how the papers perceive Muslims. Now, it's very common for the papers to actually also perceive the police, Muslim organisations. I mean, if you Google the Association of Muslim Police, it will come up with various things, from us being a terrorist organisation to us being radicals within the police service, to why we need a separate association for Muslims, despite the fact that there's an association for Christian police officers, LGBT association, women's association, and so on. So it just goes to show you that social media changes this perception and everything the papers can really put a twist on things. Theresa May made some comments a couple of days back around diversity within the police service. And this goes to answer really, Raz, one of the things that you mentioned was around Matt Chisty's comments. I didn't agree with Matt Chisty's comments. I don't think they were just in any way. But this goes back to what Theresa May said about police diversity. Now, the figures are low. We don't have that many diverse officers. And when we do have officers, they're at the bottom of the police service. For the police to be truly reflective and to understand the communities, we need more officers at all the ranks, and officers who see things differently, officers who think differently. So I think it's really important for us to really consider some of these points around how to make a difference, how change is going to happen. And I think, although I do agree that things have gone wrong in the past, I think it is important for us to work with the police service to report issues. And I don't say in any way that the police get everything right, they don't. But I think that the issue is that Islamophobia is there, it's getting worse. I mean, I looked at some figures after the unfortunate murder of drummer Lee Rigby. Islamophobia went up drastically up and down the country. The Metropolitan Police had some figures around that. It was an increase of like 150 or 200%, if not more. The other important thing, if I'm speaking slightly in the defence of the police service, is that when I talk about the community coming forward, it's also about having that, really looking at having that trust in the police service to take some of these things forward. Now, what I mean by that is that not always are you going to get the response that you require, because sometimes there's a lack of evidence. Just to give you an example, when the mosque in Birmingham was attacked, one of the issues which the police found really difficult was that a lot of the evidence was cleaned away afterwards, not intentionally, of course, but it was one of the things that the mosque wanted to do. They wanted to make sure that that they tried to make everything safe. The package which was left outside the mosque was taken inside the mosque, again not knowing what to do, whether that be just fear, not understanding. But one of the problems that caused for the police was around looking at some of the intelligence and information that they required. So I think it's important to do that, but as a community, so speaking from a Muslim community perspective, it's important that we look at gathering, working together. I mean, look at the Jewish community, for example, and some of the stuff that they do around protecting their synagogues. They're very well organised, really good at gathering intelligence when things go wrong, gathering information, putting it on social media, and so on. So I think we have a lot to learn from that, and as I said, from the events on the buses, that just goes to prove how much of a difference it makes raising awareness of some of these things and taking them forward to the police service. I'll end there because a lot of the points have been covered, and I'll be happy to take questions now.
Great. Okay, brilliant. Thank you to all of our speakers we've now heard from. So we're going to open up to you all for we've got about 25 minutes. So I think what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions at a time. And my slogan this week is being specific is terrific. So please keep to the point. Can you have your opinion?
All right, thank you. Thank you all for your panel. And as a British expatriate living in the US, I boycott Marks and Spencer's because it sucks. Not for any ideological reason. But anyway, Salman, I had a question. When I heard your comments, it reminds me of this whole idea about Muslims being a canary in a coal mine. Certainly in the US, I think this is a phenomenon. And I'm reminded in the 1960s about how black Americans in the Tuskegee experiment were involuntarily given syphilis by the government in order to test to see what happened. And I'm wondering if the securitization that's going on in both the US and the UK, particularly subjecting Muslims to the surveillance, is in fact putting them as, in a sense, it's a form of syphilis, to see how the surveillance can then be more easily and readily accepted into the bloodstream of society, either for the state's purposes and benefits or for that of corporations. And Asif, your comment about Chris's ambiguity about the definition of Islamophobia, I'm wondering is it the lack of specificity of the definition of anti-black racism that is behind American police killing blacks, and whether they had a better definition that that's really what the problem is.
Thank you. One last question here for the time being.
Okay, I just was wondering, obviously we welcome the sort of extending the reporting of hate crime to Islamophobic crimes, but isn't it really distracting away from the issues of what is happening really in schools and the lack of diversity amongst the teachers and the fact that many are not able to identify Islamophobic incidents, and when young children at school are being bullied and called terrorists because of their religion and their background, white middle-class teachers just shrug their shoulders and are not able to identify Islamophobia within the classes, and that might be like...
I'm angry. I don't need bloody water.
So yes, shouldn't we be looking at schools as well and training teachers and training the future generations in order to reduce Islamophobic incidents in the future?
And Alea, was that a question for a specific speaker?
Anybody?
Okay, thank you. All right, so the question on securitization, the first question is... Yeah.
Can I just take a question? I want to sort of combine that with the question about...
just one moment. Can we please
Can I
respect
just
the
say one
forum?
thing as well about the imams? My friends that were imams from the mosques were murdered. So what have you got to say about that? The
Okay,
imams that were
we're
murdered.
having a panel discussion here to discuss this,
Well, I
and can
think
we
that's
please
important about murder
respect
to Muslims.
the forum so that we can ensure that we get through all of the questions? We've heard your question, we'll come to it. Thank you.
Yeah, all I want to say was this. I think it's a really important point about the way in which the question of definition is not a solution. But I think something else is. If you think about something, if I said to you a game is something that you play with a ball, then what would you say about hopscotch? Is that a game or not? Or chess, is that a game or not? So what you actually have is example after example of things which could be determined to be Islamophobia. But that requires, and this goes back to the question of diversity, in a sense that you need to have people who are skilled enough to read that. Otherwise you're always catching up. You can't always keep on changing the law within 5 minutes because something changes. And not all forms of Islamophobia necessarily are actual criminal activities. I mean, that's another thing we need to be clear about. Some will be and some will not be. But what is reasonable and what is necessary is to have a, if there's a commitment to that, to have a cultural awareness that allows you to determine what kinds of actions and activities are Islamophobia, which is not just restricted to the professionals, but it is something widespread. And then you can have a debate about that and you can open that up. And because if you just simply have a definition and you keep on trying to find things to fit into that, life is too complicated and too mobile for that. And I think that's why it wouldn't work. And I think this is where you're right. The fact that there has been, there may be legislation determining what is racism does not stop the fact that amongst African American men getting killed by the police is, I think, the third largest cause of death or something like that, something ridiculously pointed. So I think that's really important, and I don't think it's a question of finding definition, because I think that's what Chris was saying, it actually defers the discussion. I think the only thing I would say to you, I think there's definitely a case that what we are living, Islamophobia isn't just about Muslims. It starts about being Muslims, but really what's at stake here is the hollowing out of certain kinds of civil and democratic rights. If I had said to you that the police wanted to look at, and the state wants to look at, your browser history, or what your books you've taken out, or you would have thought that I was being crazy. But this is what's actually come to pass. And so, on one hand, we have this claim that this is a democratic, liberal society, this is fundamental values, but it is being hollowed out, because even though it's hollowed out initially for Muslims, and not even Muslims, let's be clear, only for extremists, bad Muslims. Okay, a few good Muslims get caught up in the way, but that's just life. But ultimately, you have those powers, once they're given, affect everyone. It's not just Muslim journalists, it's not just Muslim children. It's those, for example, ecologists, the idea of being able to protest. All of these things are slowly being eroded away. And I think this is important that we understand Islamophobia is a problem for all. It may affect Muslims in the sharp end, but ultimately what it's about is changing society. The only thing I would disagree with is I don't think it's being done consciously. I don't think there are people out there saying, like, sort of Dr. Evil, how can we make the world a more evil place, how can we be more oppressive? I think what you have is a number of people thinking that the way to deal with these problems is in a way which is simply what's neoliberal managerialism. It's beginning to absorb itself. This checklist, this tick box is now being used to basically take away civil liberties because it's too messy. I think that's what's the rationale driving that.
I didn't say it was intentional about it.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris, continue.
Yeah, sure. Cheers. Oops. Yeah, I want to first touch on the definition thing, and in a kind of policy environment, we need some sort of framework. But it's this thing is that we can't have one definition that will then go across everywhere. And I think it's this thing is that it's basically the critics and the detractors who say, I want one that what's this definition? And with racism, it changes and it moves on. And I did a talk a couple of weeks ago as part of Black History Month, and I showed that every time that race relations legislation came in, the way in which you could be discriminatory towards another group actually changed with it. And so all it does is it curbs behaviour, but actually the discourse and the way in which you discriminate actually just keeps changing. And it's interesting the way in which it goes through. So definitions work to some degree. But actually, those who want to discriminate and be racist and Islamophobic or anti-Semitic will actually find new avenues within which to do it. I wanted to pick up on the point about the securitisation, because I'm not sure that many people in London actually know about this. But has anybody heard about Project Champion? Does anybody know Project Champion? Okay, so in Birmingham, this was 5 years ago, around the two most densely populated Muslim areas, the local council and the West Midlands Police installed 227 CCTV cameras and automatic number plate recognition things. And they put them around these two areas. And what was interesting was that the Muslim communities in those areas just went, oh well, more cameras around. And it was actually the kind of white middle class areas that joined onto these areas that were going, well, what's this? And there's a guy, myself and my colleague Arshad Isukji, we've published on this, and we was interviewing the guy who actually reported it to the police. And he says in this interview, he says, when I went and said to the police and the local council, what are those things there? And they went, oh, it's nothing to do with you, it's about who goes into that area. Because it was this idea that actually put things there. And then it becomes a big issue, and when they ask the question, they say, why is this here? And the police say, oh, it's because these are two high crime areas, these are the most highest crime areas. But of course, my colleague Arshad is a human geographer, and he starts mapping this, and actually, when you look where the cameras are, the high crime areas are here, and the cameras are here, and the densely populated Muslim areas are there. Now, the cameras came down, this cost like millions and millions of pounds. But the interesting thing about this is, for me, is the title. If you are in a workplace and you're a project champion, you're taking something forward. You're the one that's going to make that work. Now, I have no doubts that had this have worked in Birmingham, this would have been rolled out to other parts of the country. So I think you're absolutely right. It is like this kind of, the analogy you made was absolutely correct. It's about this idea, it's like, well, it's okay, and it's only the Muslims, and if they complain, what's the problem? And the final point was about the education. And the point was being made previously. I'm from a university where students don't have the right to protest on the university premises. On any sort of area, our students are not allowed to protest. If they do protest, they will be arrested and they will be expelled from the university. And this is legislation that came in 2-3 years ago. So this idea that actually you have the right to protest is actually not something which is in these spaces is not always available. And the other thing as well is that I think we have to be really careful. So I gave evidence to the all-party parliamentary group in universities in June about this new prevent strategy, because I'm really worried about it, because and it was right, the point was made about it's about welfare. We get told, oh, we have a welfare programme for any students we see are vulnerable to extremism. Now, I don't know what a student looks like who's vulnerable to extremism, and I go back to what John Reid said. John Reid said in 2006, he said, well, you can see the telltale signs. You can see the telltale signs of extremists, And for me, actually, when you reduce this down, it's actually who looks more Muslim. Has someone become a little bit more Muslim? You know, because actually if they become a little bit more Muslim, then actually we should be watching them. And we've seen it in the last few weeks at Staffordshire University. A guy who looks Muslim, he is Muslim, he's on a postgraduate course on security, global security, risk and terror. He goes into the library at the university, he picks up a book that's a set text, it's about terrorism. The librarian immediately just starts asking questions, she then gets security, and suddenly the guy is taken away because she thought that actually this was terrorist. And so it gets reduced down, so it's very, very dangerous in that respect.
Can I just say something? That also shows you how stupid. The same thing used to happen with the Stasi stick. So if you're a terrorist, what would you do? You read a book about terrorism in the library. And it's like those cartoons when you have a burglar, with a burglar around. But that's this is why the question is really important.
Okay, thank you. And over here, Raza asked if you could comment on the very important question of how do we fight back, and also if you could comment on the lack of diversity and is prevent actually taking away from the real problems.
So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, I think the most important thing is looking at how we raise awareness and reporting this through social media. I think social media is such a powerful tool, and I keep on banging on about this, is because we've seen so much change take place as a result of social media. And that awareness raising, that raising concerns, I think is so, so important. I agree with all the panelists. I don't think things have always been right, and I think when you look at the counter-terrorism front, I know about the issue in Birmingham, and I think it was ridiculous when I heard about it as well. That why would you put up cameras in that area? Similar to the sort of prevent agenda, which came out initially, then it's been remapped and looked at again and changed and so on. One of my key things is when you're looking at extremism, there's so many different forms of extremism and terrorism, and it's about communities working together, not a specific community working on it, but it's everyone's responsibility, not just one community's responsibility. So I think the key thing is it's very important that these kind of issues, awareness is raised. A lot of the things which have been discussed go back to the government, and unfortunately I'm a police officer, I don't work for the government. But I think from the policing side and the policing perspective, it is important to raise awareness, and if things do go wrong, it is important to stand up to that. I think the police are willing to listen. They always get it right now, but if you're continuously there...
No.
The police are for profit. Police are for profit.
Okay, so... No, okay.
That's why I was arrested.
So just to give you to answer your question initially about, Britain and the laws of the country.
Institutionalised racism.
That's fine.
And it exists, so don't deny it.
Okay, so will you give me a chance to answer that? Will you give me a chance to answer?
I quit because of the racism.
Will you give me a chance to answer?
Well, don't lie then.
I haven't spoken, exactly. Sorry, just to give you another perspective on this
Respect
issue.
my opinion.
Okay, we want to keep this forum open for everyone to contribute, but please respect the speakers when they're answering the question that you've asked.
Thank you. Just to raise another thing, when we look at this issue in the UK, when you look at Islamophobia across Europe and hate across Europe, just to give you an idea, just to put this in perspective a bit, the UK had 45,000 reports of hate crime, and Islamophobia as well. When you look at Germany, they had 3. When you look at Greece, they had none. When you look at France, I think they had 4 or 5. So I'm not saying we've got it perfect here, but there's still a lot that's being done to try to tackle this. It's a long journey, and it will take time. But there are a lot of changes. Just to add on to that, and this whole issue of the police state and the UK. So I was recently stopped and detained in Spain for 4 hours without question. Didn't care who I was, what I had, nothing. Now I do know that in the UK I have slightly more rights to stand up, and something like that I could have taken further. In France, you can't complain against the police. There's no procedure. You can't make a complaint whatsoever. Funny enough, I was detained in France as well. I think it's my name which triggers things. But my point being that I don't think we're perfect in any way, and I don't think things are perfect currently. But what I do think is that when you look across in other places in Europe and what people are struggling with there, just basic rights that they don't have. We have a lot more rights here, and I think we have to value that. And continuously raise awareness of things that we're not happy with.
Okay, number of points to pick up on. One of the things that we need to be careful about and think about listening to Sophia, one of the issues that comes up reminds me of when the colonial powers actually talk about that they were actually better colonial power. They didn't chop off as many heads, and they didn't rape and torture and pillage as many people as the other ones did. The issue, we need to understand that oppression is oppression. Okay, that's the fundamental thing that needs to be kept in mind. That what we don't start doing is, Britain is somehow better than the others. The trajectory in Britain, by the way, is wrong. It's getting worse. Things are getting far worse. Now, one of the things that we also have, we get lost in this narrative often of actually people saying to us that, the Jews are an example, look how they actually respond and so on. Now, let's look at that. Let's look at some of the Zionists, and I'm talking about the Zionist organizations because IHRC has a long history of working with Jewish organizations. Now, my issue is, for example, is with the Community Security Trust. Now, they are embedded with the police. The way that the police, for example, decimated, and I was involved, where people were able to go to the Scotland Yard and actually articulate the issues and the concerns of the Muslim community and the injustices that were being carried out by the police. That body, which had that expertise, was decimated in favour of creating localised scenarios right across the country, where people were co-opted onto the bodies who were not able to necessarily represent what the problems were within the community. They didn't have that overall picture and so on. So one of the things that the police has done is actually talk about it, messed up things in that context. One of the other issues is that there is a structural violence that's taking place. So when Mac Chishti made those comments, it's all well and good for us here to say, I didn't agree with Mac Chishti's remarks. The problem is, those remarks, we wrote to the Commissioner, and I've met a number of commissioners, and I've met a number of assistant commissioners and so on over the 4 years where I had to go on behalf of IHRC just to do this. Quite frankly, I'm not impressed. I'm less than impressed. In fact, the way that they have been dealing with the Muslim community is despicable. And I've learned how to despise the police in the way that they behave towards in those 4 years, rather than actually thinking, they're a force for good or doing anything that is actually useful. When we wrote to and complained about Mac Chishti's remarks to the Commissioner and said, don't celebrate Christmas, don't, ideologically oppose buying things from Marks and Spencer's and so on, he backed his Mac Chishti and said, no, that's fine. So this guy is reinforcing that violence, that structural violence against the Muslim community. So it's not something that, I disagree, that's okay. Actually, you've got the Commissioner of Police saying that you can't do this. Who the hell are you to make remarks on that basis? I've also got something else. There was a shoot-to-kill policy when I was introduced. Jean-Charles de Menezes was killed by the police. IHRC, I personally had asked the various senior people when I was at Scotland Yard that do you have a shoot-to-kill policy? Because there are reports coming back that they'd sent people over to occupied Palestine and been in talks with the Zionist Israelis to actually find out how to deal with suicide bombers and so on and so forth. And I asked them, would you have done the same thing when the Brixton riots took place and sent people over to South Africa to actually find out how to deal with black people? And initially they denied that this shoot-to-kill policy existed. And it was the reason why we broke relations with the police, because of this blatant lies that were being... So when they consult, when they talk about dialogue with the Muslim community, it's what they want is for you to talk to them and tell them things so that they can gather information about you, but they will not even talk about policy. This is problematic in terms of how things actually are. And resistance, there are a number of things, sorry, I've taken up a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into that. There are a number of things that if you want to join the struggle to resist and so on, there are many things that can be done. Prevent is such a huge thing that if you hit out at it, you're not going to miss. It's so problematic. And also in terms of, our logo, IHRC is at the back, join the struggle for justice, join IHRC.
Okay, I'm going to take another quick round of 3 questions, so let's make it quick. The lady in the green hijab, please.
Sorry, I attended a presentation at SO15 the other day, and I was quite surprised at the language that was being used. They kept using the term Islamic terrorist. So I'm just interested in seeing, I mean, obviously there's a correlation between the use of language, Islamophobia, and the perception. Are you working with them to try to improve that? Because I didn't get much buy-in when I pointed it out.
Okay, thank you. And question right at the back, the sister's jumping to have a question. Sorry, say that again, sister? What is the government's definition? Okay, great. And one final question, please. Over here.
Just a general.
The brother.
Yeah, we pay for our passports, so I wanted to know what the powers that we have in terms of like changing the police uniform, that, you know, to be up to date into the 20th century, 21st century. What powers do we have, you know, to explain to like prime ministers and ministers?
Okay, great. So we've got a question on definition of and language of use of Islamic terrorist. Assert, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. One of the things that we challenged as part of the Association of Muslim Police was the use of the word jihad in a negative context, because it doesn't have to be in that context. We try to raise awareness through running various Islamic awareness courses and things like that. But more than that, I think for us the key thing is we need more officers from that background. We need more Muslims to make a difference. We need more Muslims to challenge people who are saying things which are not right. Now, a lot of the terminology spans from what the papers write, and then it's just followed on, you know, like things like Islamist and you know, that kind of thing. What does that really mean? You know? But it's picked up on, and it's used sometimes within the police service.
Sorry, the reason I brought that up is because it was an expert who was presenting on Black Awareness Month, and I was just concerned that if he's using that everywhere in his briefings, and then that's just sending out the wrong message.
Of course, and I totally agree with you. So it's about things like, it's about breaking those negative views and stereotypes of certain words which are there to ensure that people don't come up with, because if we're not providing the right information, or if the people that we're using, as you said, I don't know whether the person was part of the police service or whether he was external, then you know that's the thing, because otherwise, you know, people will go out thinking the same things, and when they come across those kind of things, then there's that sort of view on it. You know, similar to things like, so we ran a course recently around raising awareness of Islamic text, because there was so much on the media around, you know, these ISIS flags and so on, and we wanted officers to understand that there's nothing wrong with the writing on the flag, that, you know, what the kalma is, you know, things like that. So it's about raising that awareness to try to break down some of the things they read. But some of the things we battle with is, you have to remember, they read the same papers which everyone else reads. Some of those views are sort of on TV and so on and pumped into them. So we try our level best to try to increase that awareness, try to raise understanding of what Islam really is. But it's difficult. You know, at the end of the day, it's about trying to change a whole organisation. You can't do it overnight. It takes time, and it takes that, you know, continuous effort of engagement. And as I said earlier, it's about having more officers who represent the Muslim faith who can try to make that difference inside. The second question was, I think, around British values. I'll let Chris answer the one on British values, because I mean, on a personal level, British values, and this is just I'm speaking on a personal thing. What makes British values? You know, it's about what's important to every single person. It's not what's important to one person. It's about joint values rather than adhering by certain values which people put forward. Changes in uniforms. Uniforms in what sense? Because every uniform has been changed currently up and down the country, and it's been modernised because one of the things they've found is that the uniform is it's not fit for purpose anymore, and they've made it more, from a police officer perspective, more comfortable rather than the previous ties and shirts and trousers. So, of course, everyone has the right to challenge what, if they don't like the uniform, they can raise their views and concerns with it. And I hope that answers what you meant, or whether it was there anything else around the uniforms?
Can I ask one question? Is any Muslim shareholder in police?
Shareholder in what sense?
The police company is not for profit. Any Muslim shareholder?
Police is not for profit.
The police is not for profit?
Not for profit.
Okay.
Because we're a
What
public
is this for
organisation.
profit? Why not it's not for
Okay,
profit?
we're going to have to move on to the question because
The
we're
Queen
just
for
conscious of time.
It says the Queen is for profit.
Yes? Could you please-
Chris,
Cheers. There's an issue with language, and I want to just address that first. That it's really interesting because I'm sitting here and I'm listening to the way in which everyone's talking about ASIF, and it's actually just as dangerous to assume that every police officer is racist as it is that every Muslim is a terrorist. It's a real problem. We should really be careful the way we use language because I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, Asif's sitting there and he's actually talking about the problems in the police and you're a Muslim and there's all these issues, and the language is very dangerous and can be very insidious in the way in which it's used. And I say this that as any group, we should look at the way in which we talk about other groups, because actually the EDL will say, well, if you're going to talk about that group in that way, we can talk about Muslims in this way. So language is very problematic in this respect, and I think that sometimes we need to kind of just reflect back on the way we use the language as well. I think the language obviously is really problematic, and you can do analyses of the media, and you don't actually need to mention Muslim or Islam. You can actually use kind of phrases which infer. So if you're talking about insurgents, or you're talking about jihad, or you're talking about holy war, you can use all of these phrases in the same way which you can use images as well. And one of the things that's interesting is that if you look in the media, if you look in the newspapers, what you'll see is around 95% of images of Muslim women are wearing a niqab, whereas less than 1% of Muslim women in this country wear a niqab. So it's interesting the way in which sort of images are kind of used as well. So language, both in kind of terms and also in kind of the kind of visual symbolism of images, work in very similar ways. And I think that one of the issues that is here, and I don't know if people are aware of the kind of Press Complaints Commission and the way in which this works. So the Press Complaints Commission actually is a voluntary code. So a number of newspapers are not covered by the Press Complaints Commission anyway, that we have in this country. So it's a voluntary code, they can opt out of that. But also as well, the other issue is that actually the Press Complaints Commission can only be upheld if it's against an individual. So if you're talking about Muslims broadly, then actually that's probably okay. And if it's an opinion piece or a comment piece, then again it's actually okay because it's your opinion. So it's there's a difference between kind of investigative journalism and the kind of Richard Littlejohns or Melanie Phillips and all of that. Different rules apply in terms of that. In terms of fundamental British values, I was desperately trying to remember, and I couldn't remember, so I've got it on the internet. So it's God bless Google. So it's democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. So does that mean that we can discriminate against different ethnicities and races and so on? So none of those actually mean anything whatsoever. They're just vacuous, kind of bland, meaningless things which actually sort of they offer nothing whatsoever. You can go down the civic kind of route when it comes to values, which is what they are, and then they become generic, and they become things which are kind of would largely be in kind of Western Europe and kind of North America. And then you go down to the kind of cultural stuff as well, and then we start getting to things such as like a cup of tea, queuing nicely, a taxi cab, this sort of stuff. And then when you draw those back as well, a cup of tea, well that was from, that was when we was, we had the empire, so we bought that over here. Fish and chips, well, Jewish communities bought the fish and chips here, chicken tikka masala, oh no, that's not it as well. And then when you actually get down to it, it's actually, there's nothing there. So, the beauty of it, and I think that's the problem. I think in Britain we've got an identity crisis, and it's just that the politicians are too scared to acknowledge that. So.
Okay, if I can pick up a couple of points that were made. One of the things is that when people say Muslims are extremists or terrorists, this is something that is being said by the various arms of the state. It is something that is being said by the government, and the language that it's used might be quashed. You have certain types of people, extremists, certain types or whatever, and so on and so forth. So they might qualify those remarks that they're actually making. But when the media, the police, the politicians, etc., basically all the arms of the state saying that, then it's problematic. And for us to equate that, and I take an slightly different point of view from Chris, to actually say that if we say the same thing, let's say about the police, there's a big difference. The police is something that has power. The police has the backing of the establishment. The comments that are made about the police, and if you equate that with the comments that are made about ethnic groups or religious faith groups and so on, you're really missing the point about the structural violence that is perpetrated against minorities, against faiths and so on. And so we really need to make sure that we really distinguish between those two ways of thinking about it, because if we don't distinguish that, we just equate everything and say, that everything is a problem and we should all be different. There are problems, and I've highlighted why the police are problematic in the way that they actually go about things. One other thing that, one of the things that you were said was that, if we had more Muslim police officers, then things would actually improve. I was going to say quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
I wouldn't encourage anyone to join the police service. I would actually say to them, don't join the police service, because you are becoming part of an oppressive system, an oppressive state. One of the things that I would go back to, the gentleman over there who talked about the number of black deaths by shootings that had actually taken place by the police. Do you know who it was? And I'm sure you know, that not only white police officers were more likely to shoot black people, but also black police officers were more likely to shoot black people as opposed to white people. So what you've had is that structural violence has been internalized by the police officers as a body, and they're imparting that structural violence on the community that they're actually policing. So we really need to understand that this problem is not about by increasing the number of black police officers or increasing the number of Muslim police officers. All you have is the person that's being shot, in the case of the States, is still black, right? More likely to be shot is still black. So in this case, when that structural violence takes place, it is going to be the Muslim communities that are going to be facing this. And also, at a pragmatic level, the point is that actually we will never have enough police officers, Muslim police officers, to be able to influence every single police force to actually be able to say, don't promote anti-Muslim hatred, don't be Islamophobic, it's not good. No, you won't have enough people to do that. The issue is that you need to educate the racist police officers and say to them, stop being Islamophobic, stop promoting anti-Muslim hatred, create a culture and an environment where that structural violence will not be perpetrated against Muslims and people of ethnic minorities.
Thank you. I just want to bring in Arthur to be able to respond to that. Thank you.
It's really interesting because it's all this backlash about the police this, police that, police this. One of the things which is very interesting is that we talk really badly about the police in a lot of ways, yet when you're a victim of a crime you call the same police force. They're the same people you rely upon when you need support, when you need help. So that's point number one. Point number two, to judge another Muslim based on what his intentions are for joining a service, I think that's quite wrong. I'm a Muslim, I joined the police service. Muslims have had some form of police force since Spain, since a very long time. So to judge someone else, I very much agree with what Chris is saying, that how different are you to the people who are judging us? There's no difference. If we want to judge others and point fingers at others and label them as one thing, then there's no difference. Then it makes us exactly the same as the others who are pointing those fingers at us.
Thank you, Asif. Okay, and someone will give you the last word. Yeah.
I don't have anything profound or anything interesting to say. So I'll just say two things very quickly. One, I think one of the most insidious challenges we face right now is the blurring of the distinction between violent extremism and extremism. And to go back to the question what the British values are basically determining who is called an extremist. That's it. And how you demonstrate that you believe in democracy, how you demonstrate you believe in the rule of law, how you demonstrate you believe in tolerance, well, that's open to question. It's not about applying rules. basically what we're talking about is a political engagement, and the only way around these issues is not going to be just by having more administrative measures. It's actually about changing the culture and transforming the way that we can live together here. And if you're going to do that, one of the things that I think there's an incumbent duty that we do not know enough about what it means to be, what the history of this place is. We don't know enough what the history of Muslims are, and we do not know enough to educate others of how we can have that experience. And that, I think, is a terrible thing. That when you have, at this day and age, that people still do not know about Muslims, and they will not know because, like you say, the kind of impression they get, the media information, etc. The media is not the problem in one way. It simply reflects the culture. And when their policymakers, what they have done, they have made these images, these four values that came through. They came through the Trojan horse thing when Ofsted decided suddenly they had to find British values in these schools which were absent. And they said, what do Muslims believe in? But they don't believe in the rule of law. Well, you know, that's a really strange odd thing to say. So you have a caricature of what Muslims believe in, and they say, and what is opposite that, you say is British values, and then basically the choice is left now. To be from British, you have to accept those values, but we know Muslims don't really believe in those values. So basically you are faced with a choice of being a Muslim or being British. And that is the antithesis which is actually being pushed forward. And I think that needs to be challenged, not because you want to be Muslim, or you want to be British or you want to be Muslim, but the idea is that the whole idea of British values is wrong, and the whole idea of prevent is wrong, and that needs to be undermined, and the whole idea of making a distinction between extremism, which is simply being determined by whatever the government in power says is extremist. That cannot be allowed to stand.
Wow, I did say it was a diverse panel. I think we can thank our guest speakers for being here today, and let's have a collective round of applause for everyone's contribution. So we talked about language, and one of the things that I was deduced is that you know, a lot of the time we're reporting on our internal state. I feel, I want, that sometimes we need to turn that action into action speak. So let's all commit to carry on the conversation during Islamophobia Awareness Month, and do get involved with the work that Islamic Human Rights Commission is doing, and also MEND. You've got materials all sitting on your seats. So thank you also to the City Circle for hosting this panel discussion today. City Circle is a completely volunteer organisation, and although these events are free to run, we do ask for donations. There is a donation box at the back. Additionally, if anyone would like to volunteer for the City Circle, please come and speak to one of the team volunteers. Finally, to finish, next week's City Circle talk is on the refugee crisis. Where is Europe's compassion? And there will be a change of venue, so we won't be here. Instead, we will be at the Bloomsbury Church on Shaftesbury Avenue, and it is free to attend, but please do register online. Thank you very much once again for all of our guest speakers, and thank you all for attending today.